Well, after the last few weeks, we've had a series of talks which Venerable Mung has dubbed as Franciscan and Buddhist monks. It's a good title for it. I got introduced to YouTube by Venerable Mung and started watching a Franciscan brother on there. He was a very good speaker and very enlightening. And so on a whimsy, I started talking about the similarities between the two. Of course, the time difference is pretty large. Siddhartha Gautama was born 2,600 years ago, and was enlightened roughly at the age of 35. St. Francis, I looked this up this morning, St. Francis was born in 1181 and passed away in 1226, so he was only 44 years old. The Buddha was 80 when he passed away. And very interesting fact for people who don't know it that I thought was interesting, I'll throw out at you. It really doesn't have much to do with the comparison thing that I'm doing, but he was canonized 2 years after he died by Pope Gregory IX. So, what I wanted to talk about today, and I promised it at talk number 3, and that's the way they're going to go up on YouTube. I don't think the talks have quite made it to YouTube yet. Hopefully they'll all be a series, 1, 2, 3, 4. I said on talk number 3 that the next talk we would talk about the issue of sexuality or chastity or marriage, things like that, and some changes we've seen over time, not with the Franciscans. So we are going to look a little bit at the precepts. Now, by definition, a religious order, and that covers a lot of ground in there. There are orders of lay people. Most Catholic orders, by the way, are orders of lay people. In other words, it took me a very long time to wrap my head around that, because they live in community, they're celibate, they follow some basic rules, they wear a habit which identifies them as part of that order, and goes on like that, and yet they were called lay brothers. Well, there really is, that's pretty well what they are, as lay brothers and lay sisters, because they're not priests. Now, having said that, for those that have not been exposed to Catholicism, which I think we only have one person here that hasn't been exposed to Catholicism this morning, most of the religious orders today have priests within them, and they're one of the brothers that has been created a priest simply so they can have the Mass. Because the Mass and the Eucharist is very important to Catholicism. It's very central to these religious orders. But when the priests are not functioning as priests in these religious orders, whatever they may be, whether they're Jesuits or they're Augustinians or they're Benedictines or they're Franciscans, they are considered on equal footing with the lay brothers. They are not, that doesn't raise them above them. That's not what it's about. The only person that's above anybody is the abbot, who is typically elected for a period of time. So they take 3 vows. They take the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And this was in the Franciscan. Now, other religious orders will also take the vow of, and here's my memory, this is why I have everything typed out, because of stability. If they belong to a religious order that primarily lives in a monastery or a series of buildings, they take the vow of stability, that they just won't go wandering off. Our Franciscan brothers, though, are wanderers. If you think of Father Sierra, who came out of Mexico and all across California establishing missions, he certainly did a lot of wandering, going from place to place and proselytizing Catholicism. So, by definition, friars were mendicants. They had this poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant that they had no money, and they were not expected to have any money. You wouldn't see a Franciscan driving a Mercedes-Benz. If you did, it would be okay for you to chastise them, because they shouldn't be driving a Mercedes-Benz. And chastity, of course, is to be celibate, and obedience is to do what they're told. It's a very simple thing, obedience. When a superior tells you what to do, you do what you're told. Now, I just got done talking about all these people are lay people, okay, but there's going to be somebody in charge of the kitchen. And they're the authority in the kitchen. Think about this. There's going to be somebody in charge of the garden. He's not in charge of the garden so he can argue with you over what you should be doing. Right or wrong, he'll simply say, I need you to go out and turn the soil in here and get it ready for planting, which Venerable Mung has been doing with our garden, because it looks like spring is on the horizon in the beautiful area of the high desert of California. In Lucerne Valley, we have a warning when spring is coming. It's called the California condor, which is probably the ugliest vulture that ever lived, returns to Lucerne Valley. So, and they circle this mountain right behind us, rising on the thermals. And that says that within 2 or 3 weeks, spring will have officially arrived as far as they're concerned. The weather is changing. So in Buddhism, which is a little bit older than the Franciscan tradition, there are a set of precepts that are taken. And for lay people, these precepts are to not kill, not to steal, not to say that which might harm others, not to commit adultery or improper sexual acts, and not to use intoxicants. Pretty straightforward stuff. So it kind of fits in already with these, except the poverty is not in there. Chastity is only from the standpoint, my teacher liked to say, have people take the vow not to commit adultery. Okay, I must remind you or tell you that marriage is not a sacrament within Buddhism. If we have a sacrament, we don't usually talk about it as such. It would be taking the refuges in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, which is what constitutes becoming a Buddhist, where baptism would constitute becoming a Christian officially. So, but remember, poverty, chastity, and obedience, those are the rules for a monk, and not for a layperson. So if we move on and we say, okay, so what happens becoming a monk? Now, understand, you could not become a monk in Buddhism if you weren't a Buddhist, so you would have to take the 3 refuges, and these are taken on a regular basis. Today is the day we normally renew the precepts, which means we take the refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha over again, and we promise to do the best we can, keeping those 5 precepts that I said. We're postponing it until next week, for a variety of reasons, basically because I've been wanting to get this last lecture out, and I'm making it happen now. When one becomes a monk, they also promise not to use high beds or seats. Okay, so you could look at that as a poverty statement. In other words, wealthy people have fancy beds. My bed has no headboard on it. Okay, so you could say, well, it's not a fancy bed. Wealthy people used to have, if you think of Europe, they used to have beds you had to get on a ladder to get up into. The mattresses were so thick and it was so high off the ground. High seats would be like the king has a very high seat. Not to watch sensuous entertainments. Now, in the Buddhist time, it's funny because you read something that latter-day, I call them latter-day Buddhists, have decided to interpret it. So you get this long list of things. Could be coming out of Theravadan countries, I don't know, but I read it and I chuckle because they say, well, you don't get to go to a music concert. Okay, you don't get to watch movies. Oh, did they have movies back in the Buddhist time? Basically what they had is they had music festivals and they had dancing girls. And the Buddha cautioned the monks to be very careful about watching scantily clad women. Now, when I became a monk and it said sensuous entertainment, I immediately thought of pornography. Oh my goodness, I don't get to watch pornography anymore because now I'm told it's a rule, I can't do that. Not to eat it in proper times. Now, Franciscans don't have the not to eat it in proper time rule because Franciscans are hard workers. Believe it or not, even though they were mendicants, when they were settled in a place, like a mission, they worked all through the day. They were gardening and they were doing this and cleaning and doing that. And when you're active physically like that, you need more than one meal. Buddhist monks in the beginning were not active like that. Buddhist monks actually were prohibited from any kind of profession other than being a monk. They were told they couldn't be doctors, they couldn't be witches, they couldn't be merchants. This was improper for, the Buddha said, you got to keep your mind on what you're doing. And what you're doing is try to conquer the senses. He spent 7 years in the forest learning to conquer his desires. And so he was encouraging the monks to conquer their desires through constantly being aware of what they were doing. They got exercise though. At least every 3 days they were on the move. Now there is a period of time where they all came together during the rain season. We call it the monsoon now in India. They would come together for 90 to 100 days and they would teach each other, and so they weren't traveling. And they stopped traveling because they were criticized by the lay people that they were destroying life. 2,600 years ago, the Indians believed that when there was moisture and warmth, life sprang up. That's how life became. Of course, we know something different now, but the monks were out there trudging down the muddy road, stepping on new little shoots of life, and they said, and little worms wiggling around, and they said, why are you doing this? You're supposed to protect life. That's a foundational belief within Buddhism, which is ahimsa, doing no harm, and you're out there stomping on life. And the Buddha said, good point. During the rain season, we will stay together. The old monks will teach the young monks, and we'll do that, and we'll practice our meditation. Eating at improper times, again. The Buddha ate 1 meal a day. When he was practicing ascetic, he ate the amount of rice that would fill the palm of his hand every 3 days. And he pretty much almost starved to death, because that's not enough to maintain life or health. So he said, you can have 1 meal a day. You should start eating that meal before noon. And once you start eating that meal, if you stop, you can't start again. So, if you ever wondered why in Buddhist temples, typically, at least in the Zen tradition, you don't have a lot of talking. When we have our formal meals here, lots of people, I've had disciples that just absolutely want to talk. I had one disciple, Buddha loved him, he just wanted to have conversations during the meal. He'd say things, could we have a working lunch? And I go, I don't know what that means. He says, well, you know, we've got things that we want to plan. Couldn't we do that during lunch? And I'd go, you know, we really should be quiet and eat our food and pay attention to our food. And we're a little casual around here. Like today, we'll go down, Miss Lon has made some wonderful Vietnamese food for us, and we'll chat. We're pretty casual, pretty laxed in our way. But the Buddha said, if you start getting carried away with that stuff and you literally stop eating, then you don't get to start again. You have to wait till the next day. So the dietary restriction was pretty big. The monks originally were allowed to have some fruit in the morning, which of course is food. But food spoiled very easily back then. First of all, the monks were giving old food. They got the old rice. They might have old meat. By the way, the original Buddhists were not vegetarians. They ate whatever was put in their bowl, whatever was given to them. And my teacher taught us that if we were invited to a layman's house for a meal and they served us meat, we were to eat it. Even though our particular tradition is vegetarian. We were not to say something like, well, you know, I'm a monk and I'm vegetarian and I don't eat that stuff. Which implies, why do you? And he said, you have good manners and you eat whatever they give you. Now, it doesn't mean that you gorge. It just means that you don't make a big deal out of who you are. Not to use garlands, perfumes, or cosmetics. Garlands, perfume, or cosmetic makes you attractive. Makes you attractive to the opposite sex, or maybe to the same sex. And so they said, no, you don't do this. We're simplifying things. And so that was a precept to be kept. And the last one's very important, not to keep gold or silver. Now, Buddhists in the world today, they do everything they can to get around this. We had a vice president some years ago in this country that went to Shilai Temple, which at that time was the largest Chinese monastery in the West. I don't know if it still is, but it's pretty doggone big. Every couple of years we take a field trip down there just so people can understand what big is. And he went and spoke there. He was running for office and the president was running for office, and the abbots told everybody to make a donation to him. Well, the rule says not to keep gold or silver. Now to me that's pretty self-explanatory. That means you don't have money, right? Well, they were criticized because they made donations to the presidential campaign. And the abbot said, well, we didn't handle money. They wrote checks. Well, when I was in college, that was called sophistry. Just keep reworking the idea until it comes out the way you want it. It would be just like saying, well, I went and bought something, but I didn't handle money, I used a credit card. You know, and then I didn't, when I paid for my credit card, I didn't use money, I wrote a check. And when I got the money given to me, I put it in the bank. And maybe I had my friend take it to the bank to put it in the bank. It's just playing a game. So those were the precepts that monks were supposed to keep. Now, a couple little variations on this. Almost from the beginning, there were lay people that helped the monks. And we see that, I don't know how it works with the Franciscan men, but I know with the Franciscan women, which are the Poor Clares, I've been reading, and they will have a lay woman who will wear a simple dress that kind of identifies them if you know what you're looking at, and they will handle things for them, like they'll carry money if they need to go shopping. They might drive them to wherever they're going. They do the things that the nuns are not supposed to do. They help them along that way. So from the very beginning, the Buddhists have had these people. In the beginning, they didn't have any kind of name, but basically they got a name later on, and they were called Anagarikas. And there's one very famous, in the history of Buddhism, very famous Anagarika, Anagarika Dharmapala. And he went to Britain. The British, by the way, loved Theravada monks. They loved the Theravada way. How could that possibly be? Well, they spent a little bit of time in India. And India spent a little time being a British colony. And this was the British exposure to Buddhism, was Theravada Buddhism. And of course, they spent some time in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is a Theravadan country, Theravadan being the old tradition. Now, you have to understand, these 10 precepts that I just read, contrary to propaganda, are exactly the same precepts that Mahayana monks, Tibetan monks, who are Vajrayana, and Theravada monks take. They're exactly the same. There is no difference. Okay? And that's important. It's important to know that these people that say we're different, or we're better, or we're older, are taking pride in themselves because everybody's following the same rule. So I should tell you that there's more than that. The Anagarika, by the way, took 8 precepts, but in reality he kept the first 9. Okay? And the 10th one of keeping gold and silver, he could carry the money for the monks. Because people would come to the monks, they would give them things. They'd give them food. There was usually a monk in charge of taking food in. This is food that could actually be stored. There was a monk in charge of taking in cloth to make robes. Okay, in the beginning the robes were what you see Indian women wearing now, the beautiful saris. But everybody wore something like that 2,600 years ago. They're just big squares of cloth. Very easy to sew. So there was a monk to take that in. There was a monk to take in medicine that could be distributed to monks. So monks are allowed to have medicine. And then there was a layperson that took in the money. And the layperson might buy what the Sangha needs, what the group of monks or the group of nuns actually needs. Maybe they need a medicine they don't have. Maybe they go to a village and they don't get enough food to feed everybody. So that layperson could go buy some food at the market for the monks. That person was very often an Anagarika if he lived with the monks. He kept all the precepts except the precepts on having gold and silver. Now, I used to get confused because I'm not very smart. I pretend to be, but I'm not. And I kept trying to figure out how did the 8, which really looked like 9, and then jump over to 10. Well, they took the thing of garlands, perfumes, and cosmetics. And they said, let me do this again. Okay, now which one did they proper times? That's 8, they keep that. Oh, now I'm confused again. It's called 8 precepts, but I thought I had this all organized, but they combined a couple of them and it comes out 8 instead of 9. But in reality, they kept all 9. Okay, not to use high bid, not to watch sensuous enemy, not to, yeah. So they followed all those rules. Very often now, like in Sri Lanka, Anagarikas will wear a white robe. White is the color of a layperson in Buddhism. It's also, interestingly enough, the color worn by people who have lost somebody in their family at funerals and memorials. They wear white. So they will live there. Now, if somebody wants to become a monk, they will go through a postulancy. And it isn't necessarily official. In other words, the master of a temple, if somebody says, I want to be a monk, he might say, well, come live at the temple for a while and see if you really want to do that. He may say, we're going to have a little ceremony. It's not going to be a big ceremony. just kind of a little ceremony. And during the little ceremony, we're going to ask you to keep these precepts while you're living here. And he would keep all the precepts except gold and silver. He could have money. Okay? It's not an official, but it's an understood condition. And if you go to large Vietnamese temples, very often you'll see one or two people that live there. Sometimes you will see older ladies that their family's grown, their grandchildren are getting pretty big, and they will go every day and cook for the monks. And then one day you'll go and they're wearing a nun's robe and they've had their head shaved. And this is not uncommon in the Vietnamese tradition. Nobody expects them to go out and found temples or establish monasteries or train disciples. They're just very devoted to the path of the Buddha. And so they're allowed to become nuns. It's not conditional. They don't have restrictions on them. But everybody understands that most of the time they're just going to stay at that temple and help out at that temple and support the work that's going on there. And I must tell you, and be an inspiration to young monks. When an old person does that and they leave the everyday life. Now I want to talk about Japan. That's everybody in the world except the Japanese. If you know anything about the Japanese, you know they do things their way. They will take the simplest thing in the world and turn it into high art. In the West, if we want to have some flowers, we go out and grab a bunch of flowers, we jam them in a mason jar, put some water in there. If you're smart, a little pinch of sugar to keep them from fading too fast. We stand back and say, look at the beautiful work of God. The Japanese go and they turn that into a high art. They have different levels. Everything they do in Japan has, I call it belts, you know. When I was young, I did judo. You started off with a white belt, and then you went to a green belt, and you went to a brown belt, and then you got a black belt, and it expressed how good you were. Well, they do the same thing in Japan. If you're doing flower arrangements, a friend of mine's wife did flower arrangements, and she was elevated to a new rank. Who would know? They do the same thing with tea ceremony. They do the same thing with cheerleading. They do it with everything. There's this ranking system. So they are different. They don't take the same precepts. And I'm gonna read the precepts now. I spent an inordinate amount of time on the internet trying to come up with a common set of precepts for the Japanese tradition. And I feel very, very guilty because I have a friend and a student who's in San Francisco who took precepts at this temple over 20 years ago and wrote me too long ago, could she take Bodhisattva precepts? Could I give her Bodhisattva precepts? And at the time I said, I'm not comfortable doing it long distance, like in the mail, you know. I really would rather you wait until we can get together again. You could come out here, you know, anytime, come out here and we could do the ceremony in person. And she kind of went, okay, but I keep thinking about her, how long is this going to last, you know? And the longer it lasts, more guilty I feel because I didn't set up a Zoom meeting. Or something like that. So I'm going to read you the Japanese precepts, and I know that you're going to have a hard time remembering the ones before, the 10 precepts that were there for a novice monk. In the Buddhist world, all of us are a novice, and then we are a fully ordained monk after 2 to 4 years with the permission of our teacher. Many of us function as kind of anagarikas. You can see them. They're the people that come around here. We have Steve number 2 with us right now in residence. He does what he can to help, but he's got a lot of physical problems. Steve number 1 used to come over here every other day, take care of the fish in the fish pond. watch a variety of things, very devoted. And he was kind of filling in on that anagarika spot, a lay person that comes around all the time. You know, Catholicism has their people, the ladies that keep the church open. I remember going to a Catholic church in Texas when I was staying with my dad there, and there was an altar society that they always had two people, there were two women in the church so they could leave the door unlocked, because if they didn't have somebody there, somebody would walk off with stuff. You know, unfortunately, that's just the way it is. Same thing with Buddhist temples. I had a friend, he had a big, beautiful bell like ours, bigger than ours, and somebody walked in one day and stole it. It's very unfortunate that that happens, but it happens. And it's one of the reasons here, if we're not around, we lock everything up. Because we don't need somebody to go, oh, I bet that could be melted down and they get a lot of copper out of that. We got $20 worth of copper in that bell. So, what the Japanese schools do, and let me give you a little background on what was going on in Japan, if I can find that page. Hello. Okay, I have two sets of notes here, and I don't. It is well known amongst this group that I need a keeper. And I had dates in here. Oh, here we go. I originally had them in pencil, that's why I couldn't find them. Okay, Buddhism went into Japan from Korea. Later on in the history of Buddhism in Japan, they went to China. But if you look at a map, you'll realize the closest country to Japan is Korea. It's a peninsula, and like Florida. It looks kind of like Florida, it sticks out into the ocean. And the Japanese would go there sometimes. The Koreans went there in the 8th century, and they took gifts to the emperor, and some of the gifts were statues of the Buddha. And one of the really important gifts is that they took Chinese writing, calligraphy, which the Japanese did not have that, and they took arithmetic. Now, Japanese, if anybody's of Japanese lineage that hears this, they won't probably care, but a regular Japanese person from Japan would care, because this is the best kept secret in the world. Before the Koreans came, they could only count to 10. When they got to 11, they went a whole bunch. They could count up to 10, and then they went a whole bunch. When the Koreans came to Japan, they brought the counting system with them that was part of the calligraphy of the Chinese. And now they could count to big high numbers. So they acquired a written system. And remember that at one time in history, half the people in the world could write letters to each other. That doesn't mean they could speak to each other. But you could go into a shop in a country where they spoke a different language and write out a note saying, I would like to buy a bag of rice. And they would know what you were saying. This was in the 7th century. I had a date on here, it's the 9th century because it's 822. And it was the 8th century that they came in, and a school called Tendai was established in Japan. It almost is the same in Chinese, it's Tiantai. Tendai, Tiantai. Almost the same pronunciation. And this school of Buddhism, at that time there were many different schools of Buddhism in China. Chan, or what we call Zen, was one of the schools. But Tendai was a very important school. The Yogacara school was a very important school. There were a number of schools. And they came in and they were kind of a well-balanced school. To them the most important sutra was the Lotus Sutra. They studied that. That was 1/3 of their practice. The second third of their practice was to do meditation. And the third part of their practice was ritual, to do ceremonies. sometimes kind of magical. And they came into Japan. And the monk that established that school in Japan, he was a Japanese, because people would go to Korea, study Buddhism, they'd go to China, study Buddhism. And China became the main thing, and his name was Saicho. And he died in 822, and he decided that the monks did not need to follow the rules of the monks. Now, I have to go back. I know this is a lot of numbers and it's confusing. The nice thing is, if you're on YouTube and you really care, you can always go back and repeat it. But at the time of the Buddha kept laying down rules. He didn't keep a book. Nothing was written down. But a monk would get into some sort of trouble and he'd say, okay, from now on, don't do that. The monk was never in trouble when he did it. But the monk after him was. And the one I always use is, one day a monk went behind a bush with a girl. And this was a bad deal because the monk is supposed to be chaste. Not supposed to have any kind of contact with the opposite sex. Not supposed to touch. Okay, don't let your mind go crazy here. If your mind goes crazy, go play volleyball or something. Don't try to distract yourself. So somebody came and complained and they said, you know, I saw Bob. And Bob's been a monk a long time, but he just went behind that bush with that pretty girl. And I think maybe something went on. Well, 2 rules came out of this that were really important. And the most important rule that I was taught by my Vietnamese teacher is you break a precept, and it is a precept, to not give the appearance of doing wrong. Think about that. Breaking the rule is not doing wrong, it's not giving the appearance of doing wrong. This is a 2,600-year-old rule that if people think you're doing something bad, that's their reality. That's what I got out of it. That is their reality, and as far as they're concerned, you did something bad. So don't give the appearance of doing something bad. The second rule is monks don't take girls behind bushes. And he said, the next person that does that, you're going to be penalized. Now, nobody got hit. Buddhism is not a religion of I'm going to hit you with a stick, except in the meditation hall and the Zen tradition where we swat you with a very light stick, which does no permanent damage, just to wake you up. So none of the punishments, the worst punishment was to be kicked out of the Sangha. You couldn't be a monk anymore for that life. You had to do terrible, terrible things. The same kind of terrible things that you'd go to jail for here. So that rule was established. Don't go behind a bush, don't give the appearance of wrongdoing. Later on, somebody was standing in front of a bush talking to a pretty girl. And this monk had a hard time seeing what was going on. And in our day, he would be a big gossip. And he didn't have any binoculars, so he couldn't quite tell what was going on. So the Buddha said, okay, this is getting complicated. From now on, if a monk is going to talk to a girl or a woman, he is to always have a chaperone. So if one monk talks to a woman, another monk has to be present. Keep them honest. I find it rather interesting that all the devious things that human beings can get up to get around rules. The Venerable Master Thich Nhat Hanh made a rule with the monks that trained with him that they all have to have a roommate. Think about it a second. They all have to have a roommate. They all have to have a second set of eyes for what's going on. And then he made a second part of that rule. And every 6 months they would rotate. So that there wasn't too great an attachment, okay, and they didn't become, they didn't encourage each other to get into trouble. So this was a good rule. Everybody has a roommate, and every 6 months they rotate. Well, imagine after about 5 years, you really knew everybody pretty well, and also you helped everybody stay on the straight and narrow path. So Saicho said, or believed, when he came back empowered, and you have to know, as far as I know, all the schools in Japan, a Japanese monk would go to China, study with a great master there, and bring that school back to China, fully authorized to teach, usually, fully authorized. Saicho was one of the exceptions. He was not the highest ranking monk, the highest rank he could get, authorization. So it was later on that he finally got the higher authorization. Isn't that interesting? A little bit of a hierarchy going there. But Shingon, same thing. Kukai went to China, only studied for a year, and was recognized as a tantric master, came back to Japan, and established his school. Same thing happened with Dogen with the Soto, and Eisai with the Rinzai schools. Okay, they went to China, got transmitted the Dharma, came back and established a school in Japan. So these are the Bodhisattva precepts used by the Japanese. The first three are the refuges, that I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. That makes them a Buddhist. The Japanese call those precepts, we call that something else. We call it the refuges. That's what establishes you as a Buddhist proper. Then they go on to say, I vow, I don't know how I did that, typo. I vow to abstain from all evil. 1. I vow to cultivate only good. 2. I vow to benefit all sentient beings. 3. Do you know, as hard as I've looked, I'm not really sure where they came from. I think it came from the Dharmapada. Venerable Monk loves the Dharmapada. He'll probably go after lunch and look through the Dharmapada to see if he can find that in there. But we use it in our meal chants. I was taught by my Vietnamese master. At the end of the meal chant, we vow these vows: to cultivate only good, to benefit, to refrain from evil, and to benefit all sentient beings. It's in various books, like D.T. Suzuki Manual of Zen, and it said the Buddha said. That's it. It doesn't give any source. But everybody agrees the Buddha said that. So that makes 6 precepts. The Japanese say, the Soto school says, and the Rinzai school says, and the Tendai school, everybody says. See, they decided that these precepts were more important than the 250 precepts that a monk is required to follow. Okay, the novice has 10, the fully ordained has 250, and let me share with you that 250 is just an elaboration of the 10. That's all it is. Because, you know, while the master's away, the monks will play. And the Buddha would go down the road and come back, and somebody had found a way to get around the rule again. And so then he'd have to say, okay, you don't get to do that. You know, monks would go out and ask people to buy them the finest silk cloth for their robes. And the Buddha would go, what don't you understand about poverty? You don't get to ask. So the only people that could be asked for clothing was family. You could ask your sister to make you a robe. You encourage not to tell her what cloth to make it out of. You could not keep cloth longer than 90 days. When the Vietnamese first came to this country, and I would go to the Vietnamese temple on a Sunday, particularly during the monsoon season, I would be given a gift very often of cloth. In Vietnam, another lady would step forward and make a robe out of that for the monk. We didn't have any ladies who could make robes. So the Vietnamese bought us cloth. I had lots of altar cloths. I'd get somebody to hem an edge on it, and then we'd put it over the altar. So, the Bodhisattva precepts start with, and I want you to know, I found many different versions that were really the same thing. Just semantic things, just slight changes. Like this morning I got the Brahmajala Sutra, which is the Brahma Net Sutra. And Brahma's net is the stars in the sky, if you want to know what Brahma is. Brahma in Hindu tradition is the creator of the universe, and the stars are Brahma's net. And just look at the sky, that's how big the net is. And in this, it lays down the Bodhisattva precepts, and the first 10 are the most important, and there's 48 others. By the way, as far as I can tell, the Japanese have never followed the other 48. They took the main 10 precepts and turned that into a set of precepts for a monk and a layman. When I officially became a Buddhist, when I ran into a Japanese master and asked to take the precepts, I was given these precepts. When I put on the robe of a monk, I was given exactly the same precepts. They go like this: not to kill, not to steal, not to misuse sexuality. And that's interesting, because I thought maybe that was invented, by English-speaking people. Yet in this very scholarly translation, it uses the same thing: misuse sexuality. I vow to refrain from false speech, from intoxicants, from slander, from praising the self at the expense of others. I take the vow not to be avaricious, not to be stingy. I did this verbally into the computer, so it's got all kinds of goofs in it. I vow not to harbor ill will or anger. I vow not to disparage the three treasures. Those are good precepts. Those are the Bodhisattva precepts. They repeat some of the 5, which in China people had already taken, and they imply the 10, but they add a few things in here. The speech issue is there, sexuality's there, stealing's there, killing's there. Slander is speech. We have false speech and slander. Slander is slightly different. It's aggressive and it's hurtful. That's the definition of slander. I say something that demeans you. We have lived through 4 years of 2 political parties slandering each other daily. And if that doesn't give you a feeling of how harmful slander is, by the time you get done, you find out that everybody involved in politics not only is involved in politics, but they're all dishonest, terrible, and they all should be thrown in jail or rowed in a boat out to the middle of the ocean and punch a hole in the bottom of it. Let's get rid of them because they're all worthless. Okay? And that's because of the slander against each other that they've spread. I vow to refrain from praising the self at the expense of others. That's a new one. Ben Franklin, who was one of my heroes as a child, his Poor Richard, I used to write down the sayings of Poor Richard and put them up on the wall in my bedroom, said the cheapest form of compliment to yourself is to steal the glory of somebody else, to talk somebody else down and bring yourself up. Same thing. Praising the self at the expense of others. I'm much better than him because I did this and this and this and he only did that. Rather than saying he's a very good person. Look at what he did. Not to be stingy. That's a new one. Okay? To practice dana, giving. It doesn't just mean money. That Venerable Master Nyan Han said to the lay people, because he's a very traditional Buddhist, and they asked him, well, what is the job of the laity? And he said to support the monks and nuns, to be generous. Well, then what's the job of the monks and the nuns? To teach the laity, to practice a holy life, to gain wisdom through their practice, and to teach that to the laity. And I have a hard time with that because I'm a typical American. Wait a minute, what? The job of the laity is to, support me? Well, we've lived here in the desert long enough to know that if we didn't have the support of the laity, I'd have to go back to work. And I could do that, but at 76, it's a little ridiculous. to think that I'm gonna have to go back to work, so we have groceries. I could send Mung out, get him a job at the coal mine. Not to harbor ill will or anger. Not to harbor ill will or anger. Now, sometimes they write down not to become angry. That's the silliest thing I've ever seen. Not to become angry. So, where do you get this perfection at? You know, how do you make this, how do you accomplish this without dying and be canonized like St. Francis was? You know, everybody gets angry. It says harbor. Okay, you get mad at someone, you're not happy with what they're doing, you get over it. You back away from it and analyze it and be honest with yourself what's going on there. And if you're honest, it'll dissipate. Just like anger. Okay, you got angry. You've got to let go of it. You can't harbor it. You can't continue it. It's destructive. I vow not to disparage the three treasures. Okay? We had a conversation here a month ago, and the talk was about leaders in the Zen temples and schools years ago, mostly years ago, they got into trouble. They did things that were wrong. And it was a scandal. And it was such a big scandal, all you got to do is go to the internet, type in Zen masters that got into trouble. And you're going to get this long list. And one of the rules for monks is not to talk against the Sangha and create disharmony. Now those 250 rules, one of the rules in there, and it's an important rule, it was rule like 5 or 6 in those, is not to cause dissension in the Sangha. It's such an important idea that we have senior moments on a regular basis. It's such an important idea that you have to give up your need to be right. Think about that. How often do you need to be right? Anytime that you're talking to someone you disagree with them? Would that be a fair assessment that you need to be right? Because you opened your mouth. I opened my mouth. I felt the need to correct someone and say, no, it's not that way. It's a human condition. And the Buddha said, it's not an issue of whether you're right or not. It's an issue of whether you get people upset and angry and feeling ill will because you disagree with what they said. It's better to be quiet. Because it doesn't matter what their opinion was, eventually time passes and it goes away. But to cause dissension in the Sangha, and that happened in the Sangha in the Buddha's time. There was some dissension. He had a cousin who felt that everything should be much tougher than he was doing it. Everybody should have to go through what the Buddha went through, 7 years wandering in the forest. And the Buddha said, no, it's not necessary. I give them the guidelines to study the practice this way. We're going to meditate, we're going to give up our hedonistic attitudes, that we always have to be comfortable, that we always have to have this, we're going to learn to give up those things and accept what is. And his cousin said, oh no, you know, we need to be tough. We need to be the Marines of Buddhism, but really tough guys. So, those were the 16 precepts. Now, I didn't get to what I was going to get to, and Mom's giving me a look of like, oh gosh, are you ever going to stop talking? And I guess that this deserves another talk, because I didn't get to what all started this. I want to give you just a rough idea of the 48. I want to say them really fast. You can get this book from the corporate body of the Buddha Educational Foundation. and it has an email address. Well, just look that up, the corporate body of the Buddha Educational Foundation, and they have many books that you can get for free. And you can have your very own copy of this. And here, I'm just real quickly going to read a few, and then I'm going to bow to you. Disrespect for teachers and friends. Obviously, these are don't do that. And they go on. They say you don't disrespect the teacher. You don't encourage somebody else to disrespect the teacher. You don't abide by people disrespecting the teacher. It covers the whole thing. Like in the killing thing. Not only can you not kill, I can't encourage him to do it for me. I can't encourage somebody else to do it. Okay? I have to not get involved with the idea of killing. This is where eating meat comes in. We know this sutra was written after the monks went to China. And they give very good reasons. We don't eat meat, okay? Defined pungent herbs, we eat those now, but at one time we didn't. Garlic, chives, leeks, onions, and one I don't even know what it is. They felt that caused people the sexual desires to arise in the body. That's an old Indian idea. All the Indian gurus did not eat garlic or chives or leeks or onions, and I eat chives on my salad, and I have a salad every day. So there you go. And I don't have a great deal of problem with that. Okay, so it goes on. Failing to request the Dharma or make offerings, failing to attend Dharma lectures, turning away. One of these ones in here that I find very expressive is do not establish a place for you to live in a forest where there are dangerous animals so that people will join you there to learn the Dharma, and you put them in danger of being attacked by dangerous animals, like tigers. And that's one of the Buddhas said, not to go watch people fighting in battle. Do not watch that. You can go if you're going to take care of the wounded. Popcorn and a Coca-Cola and enjoy the arm, the bloodshed. So, one more. Franciscans and Buddhist monks, thank you.